This is the second part of lesson 5.10. We are still covering Reconstruction. And this part in particular, you are to explain the effects of government policy. We're going to be looking at some short-term successes and long-term failures during this part of Reconstruction. Our first key concept is going to be about the balance of power between Congress and the president and how it shifts. If you remember, Abraham Lincoln originally had a plan for Reconstruction. However, as you know, that plan never was able to come to fruition. So during Reconstruction, there is a struggle for the balance of power. So let's look at letter A, the shifting federal power. Under the radical Republicans, the leadership and power of the federal government shifted from the executive to the legislative branch, in part because the radicals did not trust Andrew Johnson and they did not want him to play any role in Reconstruction. Remember, Andrew Johnson was a Democrat and he was from the South. He was chosen by Abraham Lincoln as a symbolic show of national unity for his reelection. And if Lincoln would have lived, this might have proved to be a brilliant strategy. As it is, the radicals in Congress do not trust Andrew Johnson, and they seek to limit his power. Johnson, on his end, he strongly opposes the radicals' plans. He intends to follow Abraham Lincoln's lead, and Johnson is wanting to allow the southern state governments to drive Reconstruction, and the radicals simply will not hear of it. Johnson also openly campaigns against the 14th Amendment, saying that it's going to limit state sovereignty. Remember, the 14th Amendment is the amendment granting all freedmen citizenship, as well as providing them with equal protection. So to openly campaign against that really upset the radical Republicans. So the radical Republicans seek to remove him from office or seek to get rid of him somehow. And the way to do that legally is to impeach him, since he was not up for re-election. This does lead to the very first time in our nation's history that a president has been impeached. Remember, to be impeached merely means to go on trial. You don't necessarily and automatically lose your jobs. Andrew Johnson was impeached and put on trial by the House of Representatives for high crimes, but he actually did break a law. However, when it goes to trial in the Senate, he is found not guilty by one vote. So Johnson remains in office. He remains president. However, the impact of impeachment means that his political power, his political acumen, so to speak, took a significant blow. He really is no longer an entity. And what this means for the executive branch is that for the next, 20 some years, the executive does not have the power. The power lies in the legislative. The power lies in Congress. So there was a long-term impact to impeachment. While Johnson had efficiently been taken out of any position of authority, the radicals are allowed to implement their vision for Reconstruction. As you know, they set up military districts, and the U.S. military provided for enforcement. They did have some short-term successes. You can see them listed. Number one was education. There was a law that was passed that created the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau was successful in setting up public schools. However, the schools were segregated, but at least there was education for the freedmen, which was a significant step forward. Number two, during radical Reconstruction, freed slaves for the first time had the right to vote. And it was protected because the military was there. This was also a benefit to the Republican Party because the blacks would vote for Republicans almost unanimously. So the Republicans gained a lot of voters. Number three, for the first time in history, blacks voters elected black officials in state legislatures and Congress. There was even a black senator from the state of South Carolina. So for a short period of time, there were black elected officials and they were allowed to vote. The next short-term success is civil liberties and equal rights. While the military was in the South, the civil rights and liberties were enforced, those that were granted under the 14th and 15th Amendments. So it ensured that African Americans, their civil liberties and equal rights were protected. And again, this was only a short time, because how long do you keep the military there? How long does Reconstruction go on? There was never any set agenda when the radical Republicans began to take over. This is still the same key concept. We're just moving it on to a different slide because there's a lot. This slide in particular is the radical Reconstruction and the long-term failures. One of the reasons why in particular is letter B. Corruption becomes rampant in the federal and state government. Federal government officials, most of whom were Republicans, were exposed during Reconstruction for taking bribes and for making huge personal profits, and they used federal funds. This is in part because the party really didn't have any checks and balances on its power. There was nobody else but Republicans in office. So it led to that corruption at the federal level. Another reason for the corruption was a group of Northerners called carpetbaggers. They were Northerners who traveled to the South during Reconstruction, and they flooded the South. They were called carpetbaggers because they kept their belongings in a bag made out of carpet scraps. Some carpetbaggers had good intentions. Some wanted to move south to become school teachers to help rebuild the devastated South. General Sherman did a number. Atlanta was burned to the ground. They needed people to rebuild. However, most carpetbaggers simply got rich at the expense of the devastated South. So what begins to happen? Many carpetbaggers are elected to Southern governments by Black voters simply because they were Republicans. And then their open bribery, corruption, and theft was blamed on the Black voters, saying how they're unfit, they can't choose good people. And oftentimes, the corruption also was blamed on Black elected officials. The white Southerners began to control the dialogue, making all of the bribery and all of the bad things that were going on the fault of the Black voters and the Black elected officials. Also, what happens is conflict and violence begin to grow. The official Reconstruction lasts for 12 years. And in this time, Southern anger and Southern resentment towards Northern Republicans begins to boil over. The military presence leads to the South feeling as if they are an occupied nation. Some white Southerners grew angry, and a white hate organization was formed called the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was formed at the immediate end of the Civil War for the sole purpose of intimidating Black voters. They would show up in the middle of the night wearing white sheets, threatening death, and sometimes following through on that if the Blacks went out and voted. For a short time, while the military was there, the Ku Klux Klan was contained. But again, the military can't stay there forever. So what begins to happen? White attacks and riots in the South target Black people and target Republican governments. There was one in the city of New Orleans, leaving over 50 people dead. Also, there were clashes between the U.S. military and white supremacist groups, and they're growing more and more violent. So the question is, how long can the North sustain this? Which leads us to our very next and last topic here. White Northern fatigue grows. Northerners grow tired, number one, of the costs of maintaining a federal presence in the South, both in terms of lives and money. How much are we going to spend? How many people are going to die to protect Black Americans? Also, the violence begins to move north. Race-based violence begins to plague elections in northern cities when Black voters attempt to use their 15th Amendment rights. It's one thing to have the violence in the South, but when it begins to come to you, you don't want it. And lastly, there was an election of dispute. It is the election of 1877. The results of this election were thrown into chaos because of rampant Republican voter fraud in the South. The public, both North and South, had had enough after this corrupt election. So what happens is a deal or a compromise that is made. It is a final North-South compromise. Remember all of the compromises that led us up to this point. This is the last one. It is called the Compromise of 1877. And it ends Reconstruction with the agreement that the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, who earns the nickname Rutherford Hayes, the Republican Hayes was given the presidency as an agreement that the military would withdraw from the South, and it would turn the Southern Democratic state governments back over to their rightful heirs, the Southern whites, so to speak. So the agreement was that the North would withdraw, there would be no more military presence, the South would be allowed to control their own